One of the biggest issues we have right now is due to modern science and its unintended consequences. So we all know modern science has made a lot of great benefits for us so far, but it did have unintended consequences. The two we're going to talk about today, the first one being automation, right? What's the use of autonomy when a button does it all? Basically, we were meant to earn everything we have. We had to work for everything, right? Nowadays, it's kind of just given to us. Our bodies used to have to work for food, for shelter, for security. Now we kind of just have it. Due to this automation, we're predisposed to be physically inactive, meaning our bodies no longer have to have that heightened sense of strength or ability to catch prey, run away from predators, find our food, build shelters. With that comes consequence. I mean, think about your everyday life. You wake up, you leave your air-conditioned box, get into your other air-conditioned box, to drive to your cube for 8 hours, to sit in a chair all day, to get in your air-conditioned box, to drive home, other air-conditioned box, to sit in front of your big screen while looking at your little screen during commercials. Okay? How much demand does that really put on the body? Think about how much time you spend sitting, right? And I know you're thinking, oh, well, I get up and I walk or I jog for 30 minutes every day. Do you think that's enough to counteract everything we're doing with our inactivity during the other time of the day? As it's been well established by now that sitting is an independent risk factor for many diseases and complications today. Long periods of inactivity, it's not stimulating our bodies to do the things we needed to do. The body we have and the way our body functions is a result of how we treat it and what we use it for. So if we're not stimulating it in particular ways, our body's not going to be good at doing that sort of thing. Even if you're someone that happens to work out hard for maybe an hour a day, a couple days a week, but you kind of like lay around the rest of the day, you sit, you become what's called an active couch potato. So like, even if you work out hard a couple times a week, that's not enough to counteract long periods of inactivity. I hear it all the time. If I get one more email this month about how, I didn't exercise this week, but I replaced it with hard yard work. That does not replace our exercise program. That's not going to give us the same adaptations. You need to do both. So not only do you have to have an exercise program, specifically a resistance training program, but you have to be active in your everyday life as well. You can't just work out and then, stop moving altogether. The other big one, medicine. Don't get me wrong, medicine's had some great results for us. It has us living longer and longer, but are we living healthier and better? Right? As we know, with age, typically comes chronic disease. Does it have to, though? Is it just because we get older? Is there anything out there that says, oh, well, by 40, you'll have diabetes. By 60, you'll have osteoporosis. Is that a given thing that automatically come with age? Or is it more about, again, that lack of stimulus? What do we usually do as we get older? We slow down. We don't do as much as we did before. And in this instance, we're talking about chronic diseases like obesity, hypertension, diabetes, almost any of them. Medication made it so that we don't have to worry about it as much. Now, what we forget is medication just mitigates the disease. By mitigate, I mean it mitigates any further damage it's going to cause. It doesn't do anything to fix or help the problem. Okay, so we become reliant on that, but that usually comes with other consequences. Let's take diabetes medication, for example. If your blood sugar is constantly high and you're on diabetes medications, well, those carbohydrates still have to go somewhere, right? So if they're not going in the muscle tissue because the muscle tissue is already full, it has to go somewhere, and that typically means it goes into the fat. It doesn't just drift through your skin like dandelion spore and off into the ether. It doesn't just go away. So the medication is preventing any further damage from happening, but it's not doing anything to fix the problem. So it comes down to are all these consequences inevitable? Are they going to happen regardless? No. It's not just because we age and it happens. It's because of typically a lack of activity. key regulator of aging. And I know you're thinking, yes, it looks super cool to be big and muscular. I know. That's just a happy consequence of it. But muscle mass is a huge proponent, or it's a huge way of preventing a lot of these chronic diseases to begin with. And going forward will be a great way of reversing a lot of those chronic diseases as well. I have a couple of studies here. I was limited on time because typically when you do research, you want to read all the research, especially the stuff that goes against of what you're trying to demonstrate. Didn't have that kind of time, so I had to do a little bit more of what's considered a confirmation bias, sticking with research that I know is going to prove my point. But I can tell you there's not much out there going against that. So I went with these big three. First one talks about how mortality rate and development of many age-related diseases are associated with the functional status, metabolic demand, and the amount of skeletal muscle tissue one has. So by functional status, I mean your ability of the muscle tissue to work. Right? Are they able to pick things up? Are they able to use the muscle tissue the way it's intended? Okay, if we have issues with our muscle tissue and its function, we're going to have issues in life. Metabolic demand, meaning we're using the muscle tissue. Using that muscle tissue increases the metabolic demand to constantly break down and rebuild that muscle tissue, become stronger and adapt. And of course, the amount of skeletal muscle tissue we have helps, because this is the case with diabetes. The average person stores about 500 grams of glucose on it. Majority of that, being close to like 400, gets stored in the muscle tissue. The more muscle tissue we have, the more glucose we can store without having any of those consequences. I was very excited to find this study because it did a lot of the legwork for me. In research, when you're lucky enough, you can find what's called a meta-analysis. So someone out there was already looking through all the research. They must have known I had this webinar was coming up and was trying to help me out a little bit. But what they did was they found 38 other studies with very similar variables. And in these 38 studies, it had almost 2 million participants. So a large sample size. What was interesting was across all these studies, they found that higher levels of upper and lower body muscular strength were associated with lower risk of mortality. That adults with higher levels of muscular strength had a 14% lower risk of death, if you're worried about that sort of thing. Next one, and like I said, I could have, if I would have had more time, I could have probably had about 45 different studies on here, because there is a plethora of evidence showing that resistance training is independently associated with multiple health outcomes, including a reduced risk of all-cause mortality, the incidence of diabetes, and enhanced cardiometabolic, musculoskeletal, and mental health. Now, knowing all this now, why do you think only 10 to 30% of adults meet the current guidelines for muscle strengthening exercise, which is a paltry 2 to 3 sessions per week? Right? Well, chances are you might have not even known this. You probably never even really heard of resistance training or known how advantageous it could be. And even if you did, you grew up hearing cardiovascular exercise, cardio. You got to do cardio, you got to walk, you got to do this, you got to do that. Missing a large aspect of what likely could be more important. And it's not that I'm anti-cardio, I'm just pro-maximizing my time. So the benefits we get from resistance training, we can't get from anything else. And the stuff we do resistance training wise can give us benefits in just about everything. And in terms of aging, I didn't have time to put it on here because I didn't know the study. I couldn't get through the nooks and crannies of every part of the study, but one that was really cool was it showed how resistance training can actually reverse the aging process. So we know of about 546 different genes that kind of as we age, that kind of appear in the muscle tissue. They did a study of 26 weeks of resistance training, so roughly half a year. What they found is they did a muscle biopsy at the end of it. 179 of those genes showed a reversal of the gene expression, meaning they weren't there anymore. That's awesome. Because what that means is resistance training literally not only slows the aging process, but can actually start to reverse it. That study done was was done by Len Kravitz, not Lenny Kravitz, if anybody was wondering. So if you guys get anything out of today's webinar, I need you to understand how important muscle is. Okay, and again, it's not just about being big, huge, and awesome. Happy side effect again. But there's performance benefits and health benefits. The problem is we typically think resistance training only in terms of performance benefits, thinking, oh, you have to be an athlete. But that's only for athletes to do. Okay. Well, let's look at some of these performance benefits and think about how it could help anyone. So we know resistance training will lead to increases in strength. Do you think your everyday life would be easier if you're a little bit stronger? What if you were a lot stronger? Of course, think about every daily task you do. If you're stronger, that task automatically gets easier, right? What about power? Power is just a combination of strength and speed. Now, granted, I don't think you need to be flipping over couches. It'd be a lot cooler if you could. But where power comes into play is certain muscle groups. So I want you to think about, if you look at your lower leg, you have a tiny muscle called the tibialis anterior. That muscle's sole function is to bring the toe up. Okay? That keeps us from dragging our feet when we walk, because we know if we drag our feet, we have a likelier chance to stumble and fall. As we age, that small little muscle shows a 34% reduction in strength. Now, the younger, stronger population could typically, when they drag their toe, they can bring up their leg fast enough to catch themselves, prevent them from hitting the ground due to having powerful hip flexors. Hip flexors are those muscles that kind of you use to bring your leg up when you're going upstairs. What's been shown is as we age, due to lack of activity, we show a 44% reduction in power in our hip flexors. This is what causes individuals as they get older to fall. It's not that they're clumsy, it's that they have a lack of strength in their tibialis anterior, meaning they drag their toe, and they lack the sufficient power in the hip flexors to bring their leg up fast enough to catch themselves. That's where power really comes into play in your everyday life. And if you want to help prevent falls, that's a big part of it. Hypertrophy, or as I used to pronounce it in undergrad, hypertrophy. Now, I was thinking about it the other day. I still consider it a hypertrophy because hypertrophy in muscle tissue and the amount of muscle tissue that one can put on, you should consider that a major reward because it is a major reward and very worthwhile having for long periods of time as long as you can. Okay, hypertrophy just means increase in muscle tissue. What about muscular endurance? I think the ability to do repeated tasks easier for long periods of time would be advantageous in your everyday life. Of course. Coordination, absolutely. Speed, be able to do things quicker, yes. Agility, probably not. I'll give you that one. I don't think a lot of us are juking and driving between cubicles these days, but you know, it's still a cool thing to have. Don't look at me like that, Lisa. It's still cool. Balance. Balance is always a big one. In my just under 20 years of personal training, I always have clients like, I want to work on balance. I'm like, okay. And they have this expectation of me putting them on like a balance beam or an unstable force or a Bosu ball on one leg and touch their nose and count to 30. That's not going to increase your balance. When we talk balance, we're talking instability. We're talking a lack of strength. The fastest, most effective way of increasing your balance is to make your legs stronger. The stronger your legs, the more stable your legs. Quality of life and activities of daily living, and that's what we're really getting at here. Where medication helps us live longer, it's not exactly helping us live better because if we're not living independently, what's the point? We need someone to do majority of our tasks. If we're relegated to eating, watching TV, I take it back. That sounds pretty good. I'll sign up for that right now. But we want to have more independent years, more quality years. We want to enjoy our quality life, so be able to do things on our own, and be able to do them easily. One of the major things I try to do here at Connect Care 3 when designing a resistance training program is keeping activities of daily living in mind. So I like a lot of my resistance training exercises to mimic stuff that you do in everyday life that you wouldn't normally think of. So constantly being able to rip things out of cabinets and putting them back on cabinets or on shelves, right? Well, a shoulder press mimics that perfectly, right? In a very controlled manner. Opening doors. It's kind of like a row. Pushing the vacuum or opening a door. I already said opening a door. If you have to push a door open, that'd be like a chest press or vacuuming. What about getting up and down from a chair? In my world, we call that squatting. Anything doing that in a controlled manner, building up the strength and the muscle tissue in your legs will make it easier getting up and down off a chair or up and down off the floor, for sure. Okay. Health benefits that you probably didn't think resistance training can help with. And honestly, it can help prevent, manage, and reverse a lot of chronic diseases, like coronary artery disease, heart health. Everybody wants to think cardio for heart health. Taylor came in, she's like, well, Phil, all you have to do is run for heart health. I'm like, no, Taylor, you don't. Resistance training has huge effects on heart health. Think about it. What does running do for the heart that makes it better for the heart? Well, it gets the blood pumping. Yeah, the heart pumps blood. If we get the heart rate up, we'll see those adaptations for heart health. Do you think your heart rate gets up in the resistance training? That's right, it does. What's one of the best ways of doing cardiovascular exercise these days? HIIT training, right? High intensity interval training, where you run hard for brief periods of time and you take brief periods of rest and you repeat. That's exactly what resistance training is. It's high intensity work for a period of time, followed by a brief period of rest. Lots of research out there showing improvements in heart health, specifically left ventricular hypertrophy and contractility. What that means is that's the part of the heart that pushes the blood out to the rest of the body. So the stronger that is, the stronger your heart. Sarcopenia. I'm not going to talk about much now. Next slide. We'll get to it, I promise. I know everybody's itching. We'll get there. Osteoporosis, loss of bone health or bone mineral density. We can only continue to increase our bone mineral density to about age 25 to 35. So once we hit 25 to 35, we're no longer worried about adding bone because we really can't. Osteoclast and osteoblast activity starts to slow down greatly. We have to be worried about maintaining that. And resistance training is by far the best exercise for that because it stimulates the bone. And you have to have higher tension. So yes, walking or running initially can help with that build bone or maintain bone mineral density, but the problem is that eventually there's not going to be enough stimulus, right? Because you're likely not gaining weight as you run. Not to mention, only the bones that you stress are the bones that will adapt. So that's only going to do things for the lower body. Do you think the bone mineral density of your spine and upper body might be important? Your head, John. Yes, it is. Perfect. Fantastic. Resistance training is the only way to really do that effectively in terms of resistance and by stimulating all the bones of your body. I know you're thinking swimming is the best exercise for everything. Wrong. Exercise is a great exercise, but in terms of muscle, it's a weird contraction. It's called an isoconnecting contraction. I don't want to bore you any more than I already am by going into that, but it's usually great for muscle. It's not detrimental to it the way cardiovascular exercise can be at times, but it is detrimental for bone health. There are studies out there showing that individuals, when they spend all their leisure time activity swimming, and they're not doing anything else, not doing resistance training, will actually have lower amounts of bone mineral density than sedentary individuals. And that's because gravity. Outside water, our body still has to be mildly stimulated due to the effect of gravity. Inside water, it doesn't. So if you spend a long time in the water, you're missing out on that stimulus there. It's kind of the same thing that happens to astronauts. Hypertension, I could spend about 3 hours talking about how great resistance training is for that, but we'll just suffice it to say there's lots of studies out there showing right now that even in transient terms, so short term, after resistance training workout, that your blood pressure could be down by up to 7 millimeters per mercury for up to 24 hours. And the reason for this is due to blood flow to those working muscles staying there to deliver oxygen and nutrients, and because it opens the capillary beds. I had a British professor that used to say capillaries, so I will do that throughout the presentation. There'll be nothing in the chat about making fun of me for that. So capillaries and capillaries, but the blood stays in there longer, lowering the blood pressures, because if those capillaries open up, it lowers the pressure in the artery. Dyslipidemia uses up more of the blood fats. The next two here, diabetes and obesity, I'm really not going to spend any time on. You see there, we already have a 6-week webinar series on how effective or how to manage diabetes. And in week 5, we have a really good one dedicated just how exercise, and specifically resistance training, really helps prevent, manage, and reverse diabetes. Like I said, the more muscle tissue you have, the more carbohydrates you can store without having it stay in the blood longer. Not to mention, resistance training uses a ton of glucose, and that's the main crux of what diabetes is. It's the fact that you're never emptying the glucose out of that muscle tissue, right? If you're never emptying that muscle tissue, it can't take in new stuff that you eat. That's why it floats longer. I strongly suggest you check that out at least week 5. And obesity, there is a 3-part mini-series that we have strictly on obesity. The first webinar is titled The Truth About Fat Loss, because I can assure you just about everything you think you know about fat loss is wrong, especially if you think cardio and diet are the most important things, and if you really believe in the whole calories in, calories out. There's some truth to that, but it's not the be-all, end-all. Okay, so the truth about fat loss. The second one is exercise considerations for fat loss, and the third one is titled nutritional considerations for fat loss. It's probably our best webinar series. I forget who made those. Lisa, who was that? That's right, it was me. So I can tell you they're of the highest of quality. Strongly suggest you check those out. Other health benefits, higher metabolism. You want to, what do they say? You know, I want to enjoy life. I want to eat foods. Get a higher metabolism. That means getting more muscle. Joint health. Everybody thinks they got to do all these. That's specifically glucosamine and other things that you have to eat for your joints, and it will help. You know what really helps support your joints? Muscle tissue. The stronger your muscle tissue, the less stress there is on your joints. A lot of issues with the joints come from having to overcompensate from weak muscle tissue. And again, I have a section for both of these. I can continue this for days, but I'm already boring myself. I promised. Here it is, sarcopenia. So loss of muscle mass and strength, or loss in muscle mass, strength, and function. As we age, we do start to lose muscle tissue. It decreases by anywhere from 3 to 8% per decade after the age of 30. That's quite a range. Does it automatically happen with age? Why do you think it starts at age 30? What typically happens around that age as well, right? We get to our late 20s, 30s, 40s. We start having kids. So we start having less time. Our lives become nerves. We're essentially glorified chauffeurs, right? You have less time for yourself. So you stop doing the things that you need to do to be active. And whenever you do have that spare time, oh boy, does a nap sound good. The problem is you need to make time for that. This is what happens if you're not using that muscle tissue. It's going to go away. It's going to lead to these chronic diseases that we're talking about. And now you're thinking you must maximize the time of your family, and I get that. But think about it this way. Spending, an hour less per day, a few days a week now to gain 10, 15, 20 functional, independent years with your family later, I think that's probably worth it, right? Think about your parents. If you had that choice to lose a little time with them when you were younger, to have more time with them now for a longer period of time, would you trade that? I think you would. Declines even faster after age 60. Same reason, right? What's that Tom Petty song? He said, never slow down, never grow old. I don't know it. I'm too young for that. I'm not saying you would know, Lisa. That wasn't a knock, I promise.
Yeah.
But that's the main thing here, is that inactivity. It's not any hard and fast rule that once you get to a certain age that these things have to happen. It's from inactivity. And again, it's due to the unintended consequences of modern technology. So we have to do specialized things like resistance training to make up for that. Okay, the less active you are, the faster you lose it. I couldn't think of a quote that perfectly replicates that. Hoping everyone got that joke. +5 if you did. If you didn't, sorry. Moving on. 10 to 27% of individuals over 65 are diagnosed with severe sarcopenia. That's quite a lot, right? 65.2% of individuals over 85 are diagnosed with severe sarcopenia. Less muscle tissue, less functional tissue, less strength obviously means weakness, right? What do we know? Some basic things about weakness. We know there's going to be a decrease in balance. We know there'll be an increase in falls. There'll be an increase in fatalities. I know you're asking, like, Phil, is there any graphs out there about fatality and weakness? Well, you're in luck, there is. Very cool study done, was 2008, still very interesting. So in all-cause mortality here, you see on the left side, we have the under 60 groups, and on the right side, we have the over 60 groups. So the dark blue bar represents the individuals on the lowest end of strength. The light blue bar demonstrates the individuals that were like in the middle of the road in terms of strength. And the white bar shows who was the strongest. Okay. As you notice with the under 63, that it didn't really make a difference how strong they were in terms of, mortality anyway. That, they all died and they're all similar with all that. But what do you notice with the over 60 group? You see there's a correlation or relationship between how weak someone was and how likely they were to die earlier. Again, it doesn't prove cause and effect, but there does show a correlation there. And I think that really does have a lot to do with having functional muscle tissue. Principles of resistance training. I bored you enough with facts. Talk more about kind of like what we kind of do here at Connect Care 3 in terms of like exercise programming, specifically resistance training program, and why we try to get individuals to start a resistance training program. So I know right now you guys are all hyped. You're all excited. You're like, Phil, I need more. I need to start resistance training forever ago. I need it now. I get it. Let's discuss some principles of it, and then we'll talk about how we go about doing that. So the first one is individuality. What that basically means is I could take everyone in the world and put them on the exact same resistance training program, and they will all see adaptations, but they'll see them at different rates and magnitudes. What that means is some individuals see results faster than others. Some will see greater results. Okay, and that depends on their individuality, meaning their biological age, their training age, their gender, body size and shape, and possible injuries. Specificity, talked about it earlier about how I like to make programs that really translate to everyday movements to make those easier. The way we exercise is specific to like what adaptations we're trying to see, what movements we're trying to improve in, and what muscles we're trying to develop. So our programs are kind of designed with that in mind. Overload and progression typically used simultaneously, but overload means a stimulus greater than you're accustomed to. So even in terms of cardiovascular exercise like running, if you run 3 miles every day, yes, you saw improvements, but after a while, after running 3 miles, that's not enough. That's just enough to maintain what you already have. Same thing with resistance training. So if you're lifting 50 pounds or whatever, you got really sore and tired. After several weeks of doing that, you're not going to get sore and tired anymore. You'll have adapted to it. You need more overload. That leads us into progression. Progression is gradually and consistently increasing in the stimulus. So again, I know what you're thinking. You're excited. You got to start hitting the weights. And you just remember, you have those green dumbbells in the back of your closet. You're going to have to get all the dust off. And you're going to start using those 3-pound weights. And initially, they might, you'll see some adaptation. But the problem is there's nowhere to go with that. There's no real way to progress. After a while, doing that 200 times isn't really going to do anything. be able to gradually and consistently increase the stimulus by either increasing the intensity, shortening the rest periods, increasing the sets, or increasing the reps. Okay, and how we manipulate those variables is dependent on what outcome we're trying to see. Diminished returns, that means in terms of training level and starting point. Like I started resistance training when I was 14. I've probably been doing it seriously since I was 18. I have about 20 years under my belt. It's sad, but I probably maximize the amount of muscle tissue I can have. Don't shake your head, Lisa. That's not true. No, it is true. I maximize the amount of muscle tissue I can have. And it's sad, but at least it is for me. What that means now is I need to work on other weaknesses. I know what Taylor's thinking, Phil, you don't have weaknesses. I know. But if I did have weaknesses, I'd have to work on those while maintaining all my strength by manipulating different variables. Okay? If you're just starting resistance training, I'm jealous about how fast you'll see adaptations, because that's how fast you'll see them, because your body isn't used to anything like that. Reversibility, there's that sweet quote again. If you don't use it, you'll lose it. Talk a little bit about Connect Care 3. The three things we want to drive through here is like, it is at no cost to you, so we'll ask for no billing information, nothing like that. It is no cost to you. It is 100% confidential, meaning no one knows that you work with us. Your employer doesn't know. We don't give that information to anybody. And that we're independent from providers, meaning say you are diagnosed with an ACL tear or some type of issue. You want to speak to a nurse navigator. Nurse navigator we might ask you for what insurance you have, but it's not because of we only work with Highmark, we only work with whatever. It's to find the best specialist that accepts that health insurance. And we have no partnership with any type of specific hospital like LGH or anything like that. So we'll send you to the best level of care we can around your health insurance. Some of the services we provide, you contact us because you obviously want to start a resistance training program. You'll reach out, you'll get in touch with one of our patient advocates. They'll kind of assess your needs and what you're looking for. And they'll kind of go from there, and it'll translate to one of our other services. One being nurse navigation. I spoke about just before about if you're diagnosed with a chronic disease or an issue, they help educate and help you find maybe a second opinion or any information you need on that medical condition. We have a chronic disease management prevention program. So if you're diagnosed with chronic disease, we can help. We have health coaches that help with managing that. Most importantly, hopefully preventing that. We also provide nutrition education to our health coaches, and we also have registered dietitians on staff. And we also provide tobacco cessation. This is June, so we still have 6 other wellness topics coming up. Now, they're not all webinars. I know you're asking, Phil, when's your next webinar? I'll let you know, it's not this year. But as you can see, July, we have Caring for the Mind. August, we have Work-Life Balance. Taylor, you're working on that, right? She gave me a head nod. She does not want to be recorded on the webinar. September, we'll be talking about sleep and well-being. October, we'll be navigating the holidays. November will be nutrition related, just in time for Halloween candy, Thanksgiving, and, Christmas cookies. Perfect. Let's throw nutrition right in there. And December will be mental health. Again, these aren't all webinars, but they can all be found on our resources page as they come out. A lot of them are more like newsletters or article write-ups. Here's our information. If you want to get started, you can call in. You can email us at that email address, or you also go onto our website, and we have an easy way to connect with a patient advocate today. What I'll do now is I'll take a look to see if there's any questions in the chat. I know I probably answered them all already, but we'll see. What do you think, Lisa?
If anything comes in.
We use at home. That's what we call crickets. No questions of now. We'll hang around for a few more minutes to see if there is any questions.
Question here, Phil.
Oh,
yeah. What does a good amount of exercise look like?
It would really depend on your starting point and what you're trying to achieve. So if you're just starting out, I'm a big proponent of trying to resistance training anywhere from 2 to 4 times per week starting up, and hopefully getting closer to that, maybe 4 to 6 times per week. And I know it sounds like a lot, but the more often you go, the less time you have to spend there. And it can lead to a lot more adaptations because a lot of our muscle tissue responds better to frequency than it does, long periods of time of hammering it. Great question.
Another question, how many sets per week per body part in resistance training should you do to grow muscle mass?
The hard part is again, it would be, I have to look at your whole program if you already had one made, because it's dependent on different body parts and then what exercises you're doing. So if it's a lot of multi-joint exercises, you don't have to do nearly as many single joint exercises for specific muscle groups. Let's take the bench press, for example. That recruit the chest, the shoulders, and the triceps. So if that's a big exercise that you do, you don't have to do as much tricep and shoulder work because that's helping with that. It's hard to give a guideline for each set, mainly again because of all the individuality stuff. Like I said, that's something that we get a lot of inquiries about at Connect RC. I've had lots of clients that were already resistance training. They just wanted me to kind of evaluate the program and add to it, make small changes so they could further see increases in adaptations, make sure they were maximizing everything that they could. Good question.
And another question I have come in, Phil, is besides strength exercise, I lost it. Is there any vitamin or supplement you recommend to maintain?
Loaded question. So you mean in addition to exercise and resistance training, I'm hoping? There is research showing that creatine monohydrate can really help prevent muscle atrophy. And honestly, just protein. Remember, everything in our body that has any type of structure to it is made from protein. So if you were resistance training and you weren't taking enough protein, you can really limit how much muscle you can increase due to that, because you can't make something from nothing. It's like trying to make a building with no bricks. Does that help?
You ready for another one? Does growing muscle mass help get rid of belly fat more than dieting and cardio?
What I would say is the body's meant to survive and it adapts in terms of that. So I go really in depth during that mini series and I talk about why resistance training is so important. It's not that it directly helps burn body fat, but we all heard of weight fluctuating, right? Everybody loses it and then gains it back, loses it and gains it back. If you want to know why, I'd really consider checking out those webinars, because typically when people lose weight, they run and they eat salads. The problem is that doesn't stimulate muscle tissue, and our body in a caloric deficit, we're not using that muscle tissue, is more likely to break down that muscle tissue to use for energy than it is fat. In terms of evolution, our body tries to keep fat because it doesn't cost a lot of energy to keep body fat. It costs a lot of energy to keep muscle tissue. In terms of as soon as you go into a calorie deficit, your body starts looking around like, okay, what's costing me a lot of calories? That's your muscle tissue. So if you're in a caloric deficit, your body wants to get rid of that muscle tissue. So you have to kind of trick it to keeping it. So you start doing resistance training because it tricks your body thinking it needs it to survive. Your body doesn't know that you're going into the gym to look awesome and hit weights. It thinks that's part of your everyday need to survive. So your body, when it goes to take that muscle tissue in a deficit, goes, oh, wait, I use that. I can't get rid of that. I need it to survive. And then it's more likely to take more body fat. And what happens with individuals, they lose so much muscle tissue that their metabolism decreases. So say you're eating a 1,200 calorie diet on chicken and broccoli, and you lost all this weight, but you weren't resistance training. All of a sudden, you stop losing that weight. Well, yeah, because what happened is you're no longer paying a deficit because you've lost so much muscle tissue that your natural metabolism is now down. And you might even start gaining weight on that. It happens to individuals that have bariatric surgery all the time. Why do you think there's no major studies on bariatric surgery after 5 years? Because it stops being successful because most individuals don't resistance train. They lose a ton of muscle tissue. They start regaining that weight back. And it's because of that loss of muscle tissue. And all the study sites that say, well, they just stopped dieting and they stopped exercising. Well, no, it also put them in a huge metabolic disadvantage. And that long on a low-calorie diet starts having hormonal implications. But that's beyond the scope of today's lecture. Check out those webinars. I promise you'll enjoy them.
Couple more questions, Phil. Do I need to connect with a personal trainer to learn more about resistance training?
No, if you signed up here with Connect Care 3, we talk about that a lot. And the way we develop our programs here is we get your parameters in terms of like how many days per week you feel like you can go. We kind of give suggestions on, okay, within those parameters, we'll make this type of routine. And then we'll typically, when we make the routine, we'll attach YouTube videos to that exercise. And that gives you a good visual of exactly what to do. So I wouldn't say you need a personal trainer. It could be helpful, but I wouldn't say I definitely wouldn't say it's needed.
Last question. I prefer resistance training to other exercises. However, I have not done that in years, and I'm now type 2 diabetic. Is it possible to reverse this with resistance training?
Yes, absolutely. At the very least, check out week 5 of our diabetes webinar series. I go all in depth about that, about how that works and what actually creates the insulin resistance and how resistance training helps not only reverse it, but also prevent it and manage it. Okay, I think we're good. If you guys have any more questions, feel free to contact us here at Connect Care 3. We can answer that. And I suggest getting started soon.